Hey, it's Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast. The NBA playoffs are here, and Michelob Ultra is getting you closer to the game than ever with courtside seats and more. Enter now at MichelobUltra.com/courtside. Michelob Ultra Superior Access Courtside 2024 to 2025 sweepstakes. No purchase necessary. Open to U.S. residents 21 or older. Ends on July 1st, 2025. Multiple entry periods. Visit MichelobUltra.com/superior access/courtside for free entry deadlines and official rules. Message and data rates may apply. Void where prohibited.
Whatever the occasion, effortless elegance is right this way. Because Hilton brings you new ways to stay courtesy of the Nomad London. And it doesn't stop at award-winning dining in a space draped in velvet and illuminated by vintage chandeliers. No, this day goes beyond with unparalleled personalized service and attentive hospitality. Oh, and did we mention the Nomad London can be booked using your Hilton Honors points at Hilton.com? Hilton, for the stay.
Very devout and religious in private, but in the world, she openly led the life of a soldier. So says chronicler Bardone in his biography of Saint Anselmo of Lucca regarding Matilda of Canossa. Welcome to Fortune's Wheel Podcast, a podcast that explores the infinitely fascinating and oft overlooked high and late Middle Ages. I'm Jonathan, your host, and what you can expect to hear on this show is a story of our collective Western history, warts and all, unabashedly and unashamed. This season, or bend in the narrative as I call it, is called All Roads Lead to Clermont, and it attempts to bring us up to date on the West leading right up to the call for Holy War. We've followed the reign of King William II of England and his two brothers Robert Curthose and Henry Beauclerc up north. And we've taken a quick snapshot of Iberia crumbling under the weight of the Almoravid conquest. In addition to those, we've also established the two major thoroughfares that Crusaders would be using in the coming confrontation, the Venetian-controlled Adriatic and the Kingdom of Hungary. And with this episode, we see an emperor who has come to a realization about what is truly holding him back. Matilda of Canossa, a prisoner in her own home, is using everything at her disposal to bring her tyrannical little cousin to his knees once again, and to legitimize the papacy of her beloved and late Gregory VII. This was her life's mission, and she would not back down for any reason whatsoever. She was not only a devout supporter of the church, but she was also a formidable military leader during the 1080s and 1090s. Her commitment to defending the papacy against imperial forces earned her both reverence and notoriety and infamy in some circles in her time. But sadly, these accomplishments have not perpetuated themselves in our stories passed down to us today. Well, my little mission is to change all of that. Now, before we begin, please consider joining us on Patreon, where you can enjoy more than 20 hours of bonus content as of this recording for as low as just $1 a month. We're currently in the middle of an ongoing, fascinating series covering the legendary Alexius Komnenos. Join our growing community and help this show bring our shared story to life. Let's get to it. This is episode 162, entitled Henry IV Strikes Back. Thank you for your support, thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. Throughout the 1080s, Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV was at war with the Catholic Church. And we've covered most of this, but it needed to be restated in order to accurately contextualize this particular episode. Now remember, in the summer of 1084, after more than a decade of battling the Pope over lay investiture and the supremacy of the papacy itself, Henry IV rode once again across the Alps, in Michel K. Spike's words, quote-unquote, in a buoyant mood, flushed with his successes. Now, Gregory VII was kicked out of Rome, and Clement III was in St. Peter's Basilica, and most importantly, he was wearing his father's crown as Holy Roman Emperor. But as we know, Henry's problems were really only just beginning. He may have gotten the imperial crown, but he also inherited imperial-level problems. Upon his return, Duke Gelf IV of Bavaria and Duke Hermann of Saxony joined forces with other noblemen as well as bishops and abbots and priests around Germany and made a bold statement early in that decade to follow the lead of Countess Matilda. They too publicly declared the Gregorian reforms as legitimate, and they boldly announced that Henry IV was no longer worthy of their honor and respect and leadership. Not until he reconciled himself with the church. They specifically referenced Gregory VII's excommunications, and by recognizing this, they essentially were declaring the supremacy of the papacy over the emperor. As Spike writes, quote, Gregory's excommunication nagged at every step Henry took to reinstitute his royal authority, end quote. And it was Cardinal Bishop Odo of Ostia, the future Pope Urban II we learned in the last episode, it was him who hounded Henry back to Germany by autumn of 1084 to defend the Pope and the German dukes and clergy who opposed the emperor. Odo would spend the next year traveling around Germany, the belly of the beast, holding councils, propping up these rebels. Unfortunately, they were still outnumbered, and the Gregorians were condemned for treason. Spike tells us that in early July of 1087, in Speyer Cathedral, just 2 years after Gregory's death and a year or so of Pope Victor III, curiously silent on the excommunication issue, she says, quote, Henry absolutely refused to acknowledge the legality of Gregory's excommunication, forever eliminated a way for the two sides to make peace, end quote. Throughout the 1080s, Henry's war on Gregorian clergy and nobility became a simple war of attrition. Many of these clergy were older and supported by the Cluniacs who taught them early in their careers, and they simply started dying of old age, naturally. And before anyone knew it, as promising as Germany was looking at one point in terms of the reform movement, Germany began drifting back into a pro-Henry position, pro-emperor position. I mean, it makes sense. Henry IV was adamantly opposed to Gregorian reforms, especially that one about lay investiture. So Henry simply replaced these bishops and other priests with pro-Henry men. Now, in addition to this, those Gregorian dukes and counts were bought off with vice-regal status. So the secular side of things was now fully in his back pocket. By the end of the 1080s, Germany was as far from where Gregory VII once hoped it could possibly be. In fact, Spike tells us that by 1089, there was only one, Gebhard of Constance, who remained a Gregorian bishop in the entire kingdom of Germany. It was a turn of fortune I can't help but compare to President John F. Kennedy declaring in 1961 that before the end of the decade, as he says it, the U.S. would step foot on the moon. And by July of 1069, it happened. What was once an impossible dream, landing on the moon, turning Germany pro-Henry, at the beginning of the decade, saw the dream come true by the end. That's the comparison. It's enough to make one's head spin at the turn of fortune there. What's more is that in 1087, at the height of Emperor Henry IV's resistance to those reforms, 1087, his first wife, Bertha of Savoy, Conrad the Younger's mother, she died. Conrad was still living in northern Italy, so we don't know how he reacted exactly, but we know what Henry IV did. He remarried almost immediately. See, the widow of a rebellious Saxon nobleman was available, and Henry would greatly benefit from the conciliation between himself and Saxony if he would marry her. But there was an added benefit to this marriage as well. See, this widow, she was a Russian princess named Presida, but that was the name given to her when she first married into German nobility. Her original name was Eupraxia of Kiev. She was born to the middle child of the powerful Rus dynasty called the Rurikids. We've covered this whole dynasty in the past. This dynasty was the dynasty that was simultaneously a watershed dynasty in Russian history. and an absolutely bloody mess. Emphasis on the bloody part. We talked about this in some detail, however many episodes ago, but as a quick recap to see how connected this Presida/Eupraxia was, let's take another gander. Yaroslav the Wise, the enlightened juggernaut of the Rurikid dynasty, he had 5 sons. He established a succession plan that was essentially a lateral rotation system, which was a glorious mess, just to be honest. Instead of primogeniture, the throne would rotate among brothers, then nephews, then whoever wasn't dead or in exile at the time. Naturally, this led to constant civil wars, dynastic squabbling, and more backstabbing than a Roman Senate. The 5 boys were Iziaslav I of Kiev, who ruled as Grand Prince of Kiev on and off between 1054 and 1078. His wife was Polish, which aligned Kiev with Poland. He was killed by 3 of his brothers in 1078 for that throne of Kiev. Next came Sviatoslav II, who was one of the 3 brothers to kill Iziaslav. He was Grand Prince of Kiev between 1073 and 1076, having died 3 years into his reign. Then we come to Presida/Eupraxia's father, Zvezvolod I of Kiev. The intellectual of the bunch who spoke Greek, married a Byzantine princess, and probably drank his kvass with his pinky out. That's who this Zvezvolod I was. Now, he began his career as the leader of an outpost way out on the steppes. It was anything but glamorous, but it was an essential and dangerous task. After Sviatoslav's death in 1076, he took over Kiev, ruling it until 1093. His 2 most famous children were the Eupraxia, who would become Holy Roman Empress, and a man named Vladimir Monomakh, one of the greatest rulers in all of Kievan Rus history. So I'm positive we'll get to him soon enough. The 2 youngest sons were Vyacheslav and Igor, who died in 1057 and 1069 respectively, and history records very little about them. It was the eldest 3 who really steered Kievan Rus history throughout the 11th century. Now, with all this, let's return to Eupraxia turned Presida, and how she married Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV in the year 1088. Well, are you ready to hear something that will make you hate Henry IV a little more? So, Eupraxia of Kiev turned Presida was now forced to take another new name, something that suited Henry a bit more than Presida or Eupraxia. Yeah, she would henceforth be named Adelaide, which I have to admit is a very pretty name, but it just goes to show the complexities when trying to research this stuff. Now, this marriage alliance not only tied together the German king to his rebellious Saxon nobility, but it also did something that seemed to elude the stories being told about the time. For those Patreon members, you'll remember our 7-episode series covering the rise of Poland as a political entity throughout the 11th century, and the tug of war between Germany and Kiev for influence over Poland. And by marrying into the Kievan Rus nobility at a time when her dad was sitting on the throne of Kiev, that was a big move. Poland was now stuck in the middle after being aligned with the Rus for decades. This marriage was far more than just a simple marriage, just a simple, reconciliation with Saxony. Henry IV was making major moves here after securing Rome and northern Italy and the rest of his German kingdom on his unstable eastern border with Poland, which was growing rapidly into a serious presence across the North European plain. Now, Poland found themselves hemmed in on their western and eastern boundaries. Not that they were hostile to either, but with alliances like this one, can't help but put yourself on a defensive position. Now, the marriage was announced in 1088, but didn't actually occur until the next year in 1089. And though Henry IV on the surface seemed to have defeated the forces of papal reform, again, on the surface, he'd also burnt any bridge he once had with those outside of Germany, including Tuscany and Lombardy, where his son Conrad was living. He'd been excommunicated a number of times, and though the German church seemed to be back in his pocket, the rest of the empire was still teetering on the brink of rebellion against his anti-Gregorian rule. By cozying up to Eastern powers, and don't forget those Eastern powers were Eastern Orthodox as well. By doing this, he was basically telling the world that if you don't want to support me, well, there are others who will. Henry was effectively declaring that, though he claimed to the death his imperial rights to the lands south of the Alps, he was also looking elsewhere for his base of support. Maybe he was right in doing so. I mean, Italy was being a real pain in the backside, and Kievan Rus was open to alliance. But what this also did was alienate one very important person in his life, his teenage co-ruler of Germany, King Conrad the Younger. Just put a pin in that one now, yeah?
Are your business expenses playing hide and seek? With Uber for Business, the small spends that slip through the cracks, like rides and meals, go right where you need them. Because it integrates with leading expense platforms, you can say goodbye to surprise costs, missing dollars, or chasing receipts. Everything's track downable. Uber for Business. Make small steps that make a big impact. Learn more at uber.com/small steps.
Imagine this. The best pasta sauce you have ever tasted sits abandoned on a plate. Wasted sauce. That is a tragedy. If only you had used Barilla al Bronzo pasta. Its bronze-cut texture holds your sauce and scoops up every last drop. The Italians call that scarpetta. Capture sauce the Italian way. Barilla al Bronzo. Click or tap the banner to find out more.
Through all of his successes by 1089, as Spike says, quote, Henry could not rid himself of Gregory's anathema, which forever excluded the king from the community of the faithful, end quote. He never could actually separate himself from those excommunications by Gregory VII. Even after his death, Gregory was still haunting his old nemesis, which is kind of funny to me. But there was one person, as you know well by now, who kept that haunting quite relevant to Henry. That was Countess Matilda. Even as a prisoner in her own mountaintop fortress of Canossa, she kept that fire under Henry stoked and roaring. Spike writes, quote-unquote, Canossa. The remainder of Henry's broken oaths shone like a beacon, attracting all the clerics he had shunned. But that was only one way that Matilda continued to fight back against the imperial ambitions of Henry IV. Not only did she welcome any and all clergy who were booted by Henry and his ilk, but she also held out against the acceptance of anti-Pope Clement III. But here's the thing. By all accounts, I have to admit that nearly everyone had come to either accept Clement III as the rightful pope by this time, or they just threw their hands up and turned to more pressing matters. The kings of France and Iberia, of course Henry in Germany, Denmark, Poland, heck, even the powerful Normans in the south, except Jordan of Capua and Roger of Sicily, that is. Even they somewhat gave up the fight and stood aside. I mean, I can't see how Clement III wasn't just labeled Pope and not anti-Pope. But Matilda of Canossa still refused to accept it. Little Matilda, atop a little Tuscan fortress. Little, broken, defeated Matilda. She refused to accept Clement III as Pope, and she had a literal army of the brightest and most zealous Gregorians living within her fortress's walls. It was this one woman's zeal and undying devotion to the memory of her beloved Gregory VII that kept the issue of an anti-pope an issue at all. Pope Victor III died in 1087, and Clement III could have very well have kicked back in St. Peter's Basilica and relaxed. But Matilda's dogged determination to keep the communication flowing across Europe, letters and pamphlets flooding out of tiny Canossa like spokes radiating outward in a wheel. It was this very thing that kept Clement III, who was unable to fully ease into his position in Rome. Spike says it best, quote unquote, the thought of her weighed on Henry like a rock on his chest. And it was this resistance that fueled and empowered the minority of Romans cardinals to meet in Terracina to elect a new pope. Cardinal Bishop Odo of Ostia, we learned about in the last episode. And Matilda was most surely overjoyed at this election. See, while she lived in Rome, Odo was a member of the Curia and was frequently in the company of Gregory VII. There's absolutely no doubt that Matilda was on a first-name basis with the new Pope Urban II long before this. Spike tells us, quote, Matilda must have known him well. Patrician in appearance, gentle and moderate by nature, Urban had diplomatic skills that the authoritarian Gregory had lacked. Named by Gregory on his deathbed, Odo had doggedly represented the Gregorians in the German episcopal councils. End quote. What's more is that Matilda and Urban II were nearly exact contemporaries, he being born in 1042 and she in 1046. But the thing that really revved her spiritual engine was Urban II's first letter to Christendom itself as Pope, which read, quote, Continue to trust in me as in our Holy Father, Pope Gregory, in whose footsteps I wish to tread. All that he rejected, I reject. All that he condemned, I condemn. What he held, I embrace wholeheartedly. What he considered rightful and Catholic, I confirm and strengthen. End quote. Now, Spike goes on to say that Donizone, Matilda's priest and biographer, mentions a letter Pope Urban II wrote to Matilda in either 1088 or 1089, stating the following, quote, to follow the road that Gregory had indicated to her and never to be tempted to depart from it, end quote. Which she must have eaten all of this up. And with this bit of motivation, it seems that Matilda may have escaped her mountaintop fortress for a spell and traveled to the city of Siena. And there it's said she may well have met with Urban II. Nothing exact is recorded so far as I can tell, but Spike and other historians allude to this being possible. Whether through this secretive meeting or through written correspondence, either way, Urban II strongly encouraged Matilda to keep up the good fight. But he also reminded her of the medieval game she had refused to play all these years. Marriage was the strongest way to ensure alliances, man or woman. And alliances were crucial to not only fighting back, but at the very least keep people from invading your lands and toppling you. She'd made it this far, but Henry IV was at his most powerful, and he was around this time marrying into Kievan Rus royalty. These were quite dangerous times for any and all anti-imperialists out there, and she already had a target on her forehead, like a really big target. It was no secret Matilda of Canossa and Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV were mortal enemies. I mean, everyone knew this very well by this time, and he was in a far, far better position than she was to do something about it. Well, with this, within 1 year, Matilda had decided to play the stupid game, and get this, she actually married Duke Gelf V of Bavaria. Now you might be thinking, hey, what are you doing, lady? Just write Robert Curthose a flirty little note and invite him back south. Normans are the #1 deterrent for, well, anyone, right? It's not that simple, though. She could have, for sure. We don't know how that would have played out, but by this time, Curthose had already assumed control over Normandy. Pops had died. And he wasn't doing so great against King William Rufus of England. We know this story already. Marriage that couldn't directly benefit him wasn't something he was probably willing to entertain at the time. He had his hands full. And Matilda of Canossa wouldn't ease his problems in Normandy. It would actually do the opposite, as he would gain an enemy in Germany. So at that point, Curthose wasn't a great choice to waste her time on. But if she really wanted to dig the blade into Henry's stupid little gut, and then maybe even turn it a few times, why not look for a marriage with a man within Germany itself? In fact, not just any German. Let's look at the more rambunctious and rebellious Germans, like, say, Bavaria. And Gelf V had a couple of bonuses that came with them. First, he was the son of Guelph IV, the Bavarian duke who rose up against Henry IV a few times, including that big rebellion involving the anti-king Rudolf, who Guelph supported. And second bonus, Guelph V was the duke, or at least heir, of the duchy, of the very region that held 3 of the 5 safest and easiest, I use that term very loosely here, safest and easiest paths across the Alps into Lombardy and Tuscany. If Henry ever wanted to march against her, he would have to travel the breadth of Bavaria, her husband's promised lands. Spike hits the couple and their wedding perfectly, so here's what Spike has to say about it. Quote, "The wedding must have been a quiet, private affair. One chronicle reported that the young man crossed the Alps disguised as a pilgrim to accept Matilda as his bride. They made an odd couple. Guelph V, chubby and round with a beardless chin, the cause of his nickname, was an awkward adolescent. Many reported that his wife's fierce reputation terrified him. For her part, Matilda was no longer a winsome ingenue. Her legendary looks were now just that, an old legend. A handsome woman, though, Matilda was thin and athletic, if sinewy rather than lithe." End quote. And that whole thing about Guelph's beardless chin and nickname? Well, Matilda married a man nicknamed the Hunchback only years later to marry a teenager named the Penguin. Yep, Guelph the Penguin. Poor girl. But here's a bit of mainstream media willful ignorance and spin. Pro-Henry folks had a field day ridiculing Matilda and Guelph's marriage for many of the reasons given, but they were curiously silent about Henry's, get this, 17-year gap between him and his new bride. So, some things with the media just never change, do they? But see, here's a very telling note to keep in mind regarding how Matilda spun her marriage to Guelph V of Bavaria. Donizzone never, not once, mentioned this marriage in his writings about her and at her behest. She refused to validate the whole thing. It was, as Spike puts it, quote-unquote, cold, hard political calculation, even heartless cunning. It was never about what her critics declared in very derogatory terms with absolutely no self-awareness. Mainstream media, anyone? Accusations of bribery, an uncontrollable desperation to, fulfill her feminine yearnings, I guess, according to Spike. I mean, all sorts of nonsense was leveled at her and this new marriage. But who was really the winner here? Spike writes, quote, "Matilda chose a boy instead of a hardened warrior to ensure that she remained in control of her property and her war." End quote. Matilda, to be sure, was always in control. But this marriage was enough to send Henry IV off the deep end. Henry was absolutely sold on the fact that Matilda was at the heart of every trouble to befall him, even before the death of Gregory VII. If he wanted peace, if he wanted Clement III to be pope, if he wanted full control over northern Italy, if he wanted to one day persuade the southern Normans to join him, remember, he already tried and failed to create an alliance with Robert Guiscard. If he wanted to lift Germany above the fray, if he wanted to reign uncontested by both secular and ecclesiastical realms, if he wanted any of these things, Matilda must be dealt with once and for all. The point of contention was no longer about lay investiture, nor the crown on his head. Matilda was the one thing keeping him from everything he'd ever wanted.
Who says you can't be the topic of conversation for all the right reasons? The Hyundai Tucson Hybrid pairs bold presence with advanced technology and sleek style. It's everything you didn't know you needed in an SUV and then some. Okay, Hyundai. Visit HyundaiUSA.com to learn more.
Through it all, Matilda, shocker, held firm. Canossa and all it stood for was quite literally the hill she was willing to die on. Henry would have to drag her limp, dead body out of it before she'd accept defeat. And I'd venture to say that her ghost would still be trying to punch him or trip him down some stairs or something. I can't stress the conviction she had that Henry IV was wrong, even evil, and that Gregory's 27 dictates were precisely how the church should be run going forward. Now, either way, in March of 1090, Henry IV crossed the Alps into Italy, passing through Bavaria, pretty much daring them to do anything, which the Bavarians didn't, much to Matilda's shock. It was the whole point of the marriage. So much for that edge, huh? Now, his forces moved lightning fast into Mantua, the heart of Matilda's father's lands, and very near where she herself was currently holed up with her own army of priests and chroniclers and philosophers. By April, Mantua was on a war footing, and Matilda was resecuring her hold on Canossa itself. By May, Henry commenced a siege against Mantua, her beloved hometown and her birthplace. Remember, Mantua was essentially on an island in the middle of the Mincio River, so simply guarding the riverbanks and the solitary bridge crossing over to the city was almost enough. Henry realized that simple wooden boats were still able to float right down the middle of the river, though, and they were able to make it to the city. So he appealed to the Venetians, who supplied him with a large number of what amounts to what we would think of as canoes, just small wooden boats, which Henry ordered tied into a barrier, effectively keeping food and other supplies out of the city. What's curious about the siege of Mantua in 1090 was that not a single German knight is recorded as accompanying Henry on this campaign. So who was fighting for him? Well, on his way south, he approached Jewish communities in the cities of Spires and Worms, and in exchange for large sums of money, he promised them protection, which, as their king, I kind of thought should be a given, but hey, they were Jews in Germany. So historians believe with some bit of confidence that he simply crossed the Alps with these funds and used them in the southern Alpine foothills to amass an army of Lombards, which he'd done before. Now, inside Mantua, before the blockade was fully established, Matilda was wheeling and dealing with loyalists around her. For starters, she placed her child groom in charge of Mantua's defenses, who, by many accounts, he did a great job. Henry IV's first wave of attacks on the city were repelled by way of stones being thrown from its high walls, which actually is credited with killing a good number of Henry's men. Mantua was able to hold out for almost a year. It was 11 months until, given the circumstances, Guelph V gave the city over to the emperor, which is probably what earned him eternal hatred from Matilda. And as Henry and his men were crossing the bridge into Mantua, all the Countess's horses and all the Countess's men were frantically loading boats with weapons, luxuries, money, people, and church chalices, censers, crucifixes, and reliquaries. And these happened to be the remolded gold and silver once donated by Duke Bonifacio, Matilda's beloved and much-missed father. Now, to Henry's credit, he and his army entered the city pretty calmly, under a bright Easter moon. We're told his men simply took the positions that the Mantuans and Bavarians once held on the ramparts, and Henry moved into Bonifacio's old home, like the building itself. And that building was the very birthplace of Matilda. Out of all of this, having Henry sleep comfortably in her father's house must have given Matilda grief and rage that knew no bounds. It was a peaceful surrender of the city either way, though, and Mantua fell in April of 1091. What's more is that Henry took Mass in Mantua's cathedral, a cathedral that held the body of Bishop Anselmo of Lucca, Matilda's closest friend and advisor in Canossa, even before the death of Gregory VII. Bishop Anselmo was also one of those three that Gregory once suggested as his successor, meaning that Bishop Anselmo was also one of the sworn enemies of Henry IV. What's more is that Anselmo was now beatified due to the numerous reports of miracles at his tomb since his death a few years earlier. So in a cathedral with St. Anselmo's body in it, Henry would observe Mass and take communion from his own anti-Gregorian priest. As Spike says, it's all just so weird, but symbolically, it really does show us the state of Matilda's mission in the spring of 1091. She was not sitting very nicely. Now, regardless of any peaceful transfer of power in Mantua, the peace in Henry's heart pretty much gave way at that point to his bitterness toward Matilda after Mantua. He ordered the lands north of the River Po to be torched, and he even ordered one of Matilda's most favorite places in the entire world, a monastery her great-grandfather once founded, San Benedetto Po, to be obliterated. Henry was seeing red. While Matilda grieved and raged at Canossa, her father-in-law, Guelph IV, who had been stripped of his duchy recently, made overtures to Henry. Yeah, without Matilda's knowledge. He met the king at the city of Verona to lay out a few conditions for an end to hostilities, but Henry outright refused. One of the concessions was that Henry give up Clement III's claim on the papacy, thus legitimizing Gregory VII's papacy. He also required Henry to give him his duchy back. And lastly, he demanded Henry return the lands north of the Po back to Matilda. These were some big demands for somebody with absolutely no leverage. Why in the world would he ever think Henry would agree to any of that? They're just ludicrous demands by a desperate man. Henry was winning this war. Why on earth would he ever give in? Well, as I said, he didn't. Not one concession was granted, and the war raged on. And Matilda found out what her father-in-law did. Now, Matilda had spies everywhere, and her spies were telling her that Henry loosely disbanded his army for the winter, that is, the winter of 1091 to 92. And he was only keeping a meager number of men as security detail. He was wintering just north of the river Adige. Matilda went on the attack. She ordered 1,000 infantrymen led by a lowly foot soldier to attack the king in a surprise ambush, but Henry was able to escape, unlike many of his men who fell in the attack. It was a pretty harsh blow to Henry, given he had to be in constant run for the better part of 8 days, until he found refuge with another contingent of men he'd set up nearby. More than that, though, over those 8 days, his hatred for Matilda grew and grew and grew. Once he was safe, Henry ordered a man named Ugo of Manso to approach Matilda's leader of the infantry. Again, it was a lowly foot soldier with no real experience dealing with nobility or the kind. And this guy, Ugo of Manso, suggested that Henry was no longer wanting to fight. Well, that was quite a turn, wasn't it? His harrowing ordeal had been enough, and he was done. This, of course, was a ruse, and the infantrymen agreed to peace terms, just not seeing it for what it was. That night, they all set up camp outside of Padua, calmer and less at the ready as they'd been during the war. Well, Henry's men attacked them, and many died before taking cover in the forests. A dear friend of Matilda's, a man named Manfredo, was captured in the chaos. The worst part of this whole ordeal, though, was that Ugo of Manso, Henry's man who offered peace, was actually the uncle of her husband and brother to her father-in-law in Bavaria. This just highlights the depth of complexity Matilda's situation really was. Matilda held firm, though, even after this horrible defeat, encouraging her troops at Canossa with these words, quote unquote, "Events change, thus now you win, now you lose, but steadfast courage will ordain the victory." So she's a bit of a motivational speaker as well, it seems. Now fast forward to the summer of 1092, so 5, 6, 7 months later, which apparently was a scorching one, as the mighty Po River didn't even rise above knee level that summer. From her mountaintop fortress, Matilda could see for tens of miles in a breathtaking 360-degree view, and what she saw way off in the distance, every so often, was Henry's massive army of Lombards crisscrossing her beloved valleys. The people of Tuscany were losing hope, quickly. Before she knew it, in the blazing sun of summer, Reggio and Modena both fell. It must have seemed like Matilda's entire world was shrinking around her, closing in on her like a boa constrictor, tightening its grip with every exhalation she gave. And then, all of a sudden, Henry turned his army toward Canossa itself. He sought to further constrict her instead of just pushing straight into Canossa. He crisscrossed the Apennine mountain peaks, taking one of these peaks at a time. It's recorded that as they came nearer and nearer, Matilda could see the sun shining off their metal helmets like, as Spike says, quote unquote, 1,000 diamonds. First to fall was the peak to the east of Canossa, called Monte Morello, then Monte Alfredo. Her forces did all they could to stall this eventual attack on Canossa by luring them away from Canossa in strategic retreats and whatnot, but there's no evidence to prove that. We do know that Henry would while away the next 2 months in a pointless siege of the fortress at Montevideo. At Montevideo, Henry had a horrible time of it. The defenders, somehow due to secret gates in and out of the fortress, were able to harass Henry's forces and kill a great many of his Lombards. But when Henry pushed his wooden siege gate engines toward the walls and the gates of the walls, the defenders would burn them, also killing many of Henry's men. Montevideo gave Henry endless headaches. And what's more, was Henry found in the rubble and ash of one of his siege engines, one of his illegitimate sons, dead. By August 9th, 1092, still unable to take Montevideo, Pope Clement III, that is, Anti-Pope Clement III, was in Henry's camp. Henry called him to Montevideo to negotiate peace with Matilda. His only demand was that Matilda recognize Clement III as the rightful pope. Donazoni writes, quote, many people, abbots, hermits, and bishops, saints, united to discuss the proposed peace, end quote. This council took place just south of Canossa, at a smaller yet still heavily fortified city of Carpeneto. Canossa may have been the top of the world, but Carpeneto was the center of it for Matilda in September of 1092. This was a pivotal moment in her life that would define what she did and how she did it for the rest of her life. Everything she had and had done in her past led her to Carpeneto in front of these men, the sole lady in attendance sitting at the head of all of them. The date was September 5th, 1092. The deposed Bishop of Reggio, a man named Eriberto, stood to speak first, saying, quote, endurance obtains no truce from time, end quote, which is to say he voted for peace with the emperor. Each man stood and gave a similar suggestion. Matilda was outvoted by far. The overwhelming majority sought peace with Henry. Spike writes, however, quote, at that moment, when all seemed lost, God stepped in, end quote. A hermit, who had wrapped himself in a terry cloth, stood to address the assembly. His name was simply Giovanni. He did not address the assembly of men. Rather, he turned to Matilda herself, which gave the room pause. He was, as Spike says, excruciatingly thin, and listened from the back row of the church. He had dark eyes and a gaunt face. Donazoni records him saying this, quote, you will never concede, because such a peace is contrary to the Holy Spirit, to the Father, and also to his Son. How can you squander thus the fatigue and sacrifice that in the name of Christ you have sustained? Fight, do not hesitate, because heaven will soon grant you a great victory. It will be a gift of Christ who has been rendered benign by the prayers of Peter, and with this you will rejoice. End quote. Those in attendance were stunned into a long silence, lasting well after the diminutive hermit in the back of the room took his seat. Well, like any great 80s movie, I imagine there had to have been a slow clap that soon crescendoed into a defiant whooping and hollering in support of their countess. I'm kidding, obviously, but the tide did turn. Nearly everyone in attendance rallied around their lady, and they voted against those peace terms. Henry was beside himself when he heard the news. And what happened next is quite a harrowing story. Now, moving his army to Reggio for a few days, Henry IV gathered his forces all together and readied them for the most dangerous part of the entire Italian invasion. He was determined to once and for all take Canossa. As for Matilda, she hurried back to Canossa and called every single fighting man to her fortress. From there, she divided them up into two armies. One would stay and defend Canossa up and down the mountainside and in the fortress itself, while the other would play decoy and head to a nearby fortress. She decided to go with this second army to the other fortress, which is a curious decision. Her journey became fraught with terror and danger at this point. See, as she crossed a ridge, and try to picture this, it really helped me to picture this. As she crossed a ridge, she could hear the rumbling hooves of Henry's army marching along the ridge opposite her. She pressed her men on very quietly. The two armies were passing by one another. We don't know if Henry knew of Matilda or the army she was with was noticed at the time. Reaching the chapel of St. Nicholas, Henry was able to look out and see the mighty fortress of Canossa sitting proudly atop its peak with sheer cliffs on three of its sides. And much to his anger, Matilda had ordered to fly from Canossa's 6 towers the banners with Pope Gregory VII's papal coat of arms on them. She pushed his army on to the small plains below Canossa, right behind Henry's army. When he reached the base of the mountains, he ordered a full attack. Outside Canossa, Lombards and Germans scrambled and climbed their way up to the fortress's walls, while inside Canossa, the loudest voices came from the church and the ramparts where all of Matilda's assembled clergy were. Abbots, bishops, priests, and monks of all sorts, right alongside with the fighting men. These abbots, bishops, priests, and monks, while the men were fighting, these men were singing hymns and praying the loudest prayers for God's intervention and appealing to the saints for their divine assistance against those opposed to Gregory's reforms. And as Henry's men made their way up and up and up, weathering the arrows and stones and fire being thrown at them from those walls and towers high, high above, well, a thin mist began to creep up the mountainside. Spike writes, quote, "It drooped like wreaths over the clumps of shrubbery. It rose, swirling about the feet of the fighters. The knights only saw straight ahead through a single tiny slit in their black metal visors. Shut tight to protect them from arrows, they were unaware of the white mist. The mist swirled about Henry's ankles too, but he failed to see it as well. He had his eyes fixed on the prize, to capture Canossa and vindicate his reign. As he watched the huge haunches of the black stallions stampede toward the gray sandstone rock, Henry noticed too late that the mist had become a fine cloud. It lay heavy and damp on his woolen cloak. His hair felt cold and wet. The mist grew thicker. The horses, their black, fearsome riders, their lances and axes, and even the peak of Canossa had become invisible, lost in an impervious fog." End quote. I've said countless times on the show already, Spike is a phenomenal writer. Really painted that picture well. Now she continues, quote unquote, "Confusion turned to fear, then to panic. The horses lost their footing. Mount and rider stumbled down the steep ridges, crushing the knights or sending both horse and rider headlong to their deaths." But see, Where Henry's men were new to the area, Matilda had at her disposal an entire army of locals, men who knew very well the fogs and the valleys and the blistering heat and the places to safely travel on foot and horseback up and down this treacherous mountainside. Having snuck around the back of Henry's forces earlier, she saw the fog roll in and she ordered her attack. It was a bloody affair at this point, both sides in a desperate fight. Matilda lost men, but Henry lost more, due to the lack of visibility and understanding of where the cliffs were. At one point, Henry's standard bearer fell off his horse. He couldn't rise quick enough, given the weight of his armor, and one of Matilda's men swooped in and stole his flag. At this, Henry called for a full retreat. Only a small portion of his attackers actually returned with him that night. One day later, Henry was reported at a full and hasty retreat north of the Po. All in attendance, even Henry considered this divine intervention. And even Henry wasn't willing to risk it all to fight it. By the time Henry retreated to Verona, the Lombards had completely given up on him. Spike tells us by early the next year, 1093, all the pro-Henry bishops in Milan, Cremona, Lodi, and Piacenza, quote, seceded from the German Empire and united to form their own political unit called La Lega, or the League. The League entered into a treaty with Matilda as quote-unquote soldiers of St. Peter against their former sovereign, the German king. End quote from Spike. If you thought his barefoot, betunicked groveling at Canossa in 1077 was humiliating, 1092 was, military and politically, far worse. And Matilda sat at the head of both events. Spike sums it up, quote-unquote, Henry lost his royal dignity at Canossa in 1092. I know I've quoted from Spike quite a bit already, but she really does lay out Matilda in 1092 quite nicely, which I want to share before we end this episode. She writes, quote, who was Matilda? She was one who risked everything for her faith. She believed in prophets and in miracles, and her faith was justified. I don't think it's possible to say that in this victory Matilda was, quote-unquote, directed by any great man. They had died. She continued. She ignored temptations. She rejected compromises. She suffered. She chose. To assign her success at Canossa to Gregory VII denies the prayers of the bishops and abbots and monks and priests who defended that fortress. They count. So does Matilda. End quote. Matilda's story is hardly finished, if you can believe it. But on this episode alone, she went from somewhere in the middle to her face in the mud to her rising above an emperor who despised her and who had all the cards of negotiation and leverage. How can one not be impressed with Matilda of Canossa? On the next episode, we push ourselves further into Matilda's war against Henry IV, but this time, for Henry, boy, it really hits close to home. And I can't wait to tell you about it.